Greetings sailors and welcome to a warships replay of mine. This time it's the Monarch, the tier 8 British battleship. Now this one is interesting for a number of reasons, the ship rather than the replay, although I hope the replay is interesting as well, of course. But yeah, the Monarch along with the Queen Elizabeth has basically more or less normal HE fire chance. Now it does still have the shorter fuse times and it does still have the extra penetration for those HE shells, but the actual fire chance of the HE shells is much more in line with the battleships of the respective tiers. So for tier 6, I mean it's still kind of on the high-ish side, but 35% at tier 6 is not completely unprecedented. The Dunkirk gets that, the Bayern gets that, and the Warspite has just under 35%. It's got, indeed, 34%. I don't know why I didn't just say that. That would have been simpler. Anyway, and then at tier 8, well, most of the tier 8 battleships do have around 35%. I think Amagi is the only exception. Actually, having said that, I'm not sure what the Key has, but Amagi was around 30%. Key is probably similar-ish. But, yeah. Anyway, my point is that these particular two battleships, these 15-inch gunned battleships, are in some ways a glimpse into what the rest of the line might be like if you didn't have that absurdly high HE fire chance. And personally, I would have quite enjoyed the rest of the line being like that. I think it would have been fine, because these two ships in particular of all of the line feel, I think, the least gimmicky overall. And, I mean, the Monarch itself is not a bad ship. So, if the rest of the line were like that as well, you know, it would just be less annoying to deal with, because for all of the rest of them, you can absolutely just get away with firing nothing but HE. Because you will have an extremely good chance of setting fires, and sometimes multiple fires, especially with the tier 9 and the tier 10. There's also the premiums, of course. Of the premiums, the only one that kind of fits in with the regular line, the rest of the regular line ships in terms of its shells, is the Nelson, which has the same short fuses, the same high fire chance, and of course the high penetration. Warspite has better AP and, you know, normal air quotes HE. I don't think it gets the extra penetration. I think it's still the third of the caliber rule instead of is it a quarter or something? I can't remember. Or is it the other? I think it's the other way around. Or is it? I confused myself now. Anyway, Warspite doesn't have the special HE. And then you've got Hood, which has got the short AP fuses, but doesn't have the special AP either. So Hood is kind of like the worst of all of them in that regard. It gets the worst AP, but it doesn't get the better HE. So that's one more reason why the Hood is kind of a bit frustrating to play, although a large part of it is also that it just doesn't have very good forward firepower. Because a lot of the time you're going to be wanting to use your forward firepower in a battleship, and only having 4 guns versus, you know, the 6 on the Monarch, for instance, that's a fairly, you know, steep reduction in firepower. And of course, you know, the Germans are in the same boat. The Germans don't have particularly good accuracy, neither do the British for the most part, but with the German 15-inch shells you have faster shell velocities, and you also have, of course, better penetration. So it kind of makes up for that to some extent, because you know that if you can land those hits, they'll actually be quite effective, whereas with the Hoods, it absolutely does not feel effective. So yeah, the Monarch I'm kind of enjoying, but it's going to be a long grind to the Lion. And in some ways, it's almost like the British battleships where... the German battleships, where the peak of the line is tier 8 with the Bismarck. Now, the tier 9 and 10 German battleships are okay as well, but the Bismarck is just kind of like the most fun. And the Monarch, I'm not sure it's as fun as the Bismarck, but the Lion and the Conqueror are just such gimmick ships, and not in a good way, that I don't know, maybe I just have too much conscience when I'm playing these things. Because even when I'm playing something like the Nelson, when you've got that monstrous HE, or the KGV, you know, I still try and use the AP quite a lot, even though it's probably far from optimal. So anyway, that's the Monarch itself. That's where I'm at with the RN grind so far. And onto this actual game where we are top tier. And as you can see, well, we have no map control whatsoever, at least for the time being. The enemy team's about to cap B, they've already got A and C, and it's not looking that good. They have lost one ship already, but overall, yeah, this is not a good start. Normally when you have this kind of a start to a game, you tend to get that sinking feeling, and quite often it is then followed up by an actual sinking feeling as your ship slips beneath the waves because your team crumples. Because generally speaking, if your team is ceding this much control to the enemy team, they're also not particularly effective at actually doing damage to the enemy team. But that isn't necessarily always true. You know, it might be true the majority of the time, but that doesn't mean the same thing as being true all of the time. So it's around about now that I was thinking to myself that actually I'm being maybe a bit passive here, you know, looking at the minimap, looking at the fact that the enemy team is racking up all these points, that, yeah, I should really start to be a little bit more aggressive. I should use my armor, use my hit points, and try and push things a bit. Because when you're in a top tier battleship like this, you do have a certain amount of responsibility. It is, of course, possible to judge it wrong and to be aggressive too early, or to push in to a situation where you unexpectedly have too many ships firing at you, because you do ideally want to try and always limit the number of ships that can possibly fire at you. You want to limit the engagements so that you've got it in your favour. You don't want to be pushing in to a situation where multiple ships can fire at you necessarily. But you've got to balance that against the fact that if you're playing too passively, then this kind of situation can happen. Now, we are starting to try and take back C. One of our destroyers is capping. But the rest of us need to do something as well to really pick up the pace, because the enemy team is now doing about twice as well as us in terms of the actual victory points. And no, there we go. We've actually the destroyer that was capping has got out. So yeah, we're not even blocking them from getting all 3 cap points now. However, of course, it doesn't have to be a disaster. Now I'm starting to push in. We've got the team starting to be a bit more aggressive around the C cap as well. And so, although, I mean, my kind of earlier passiveness, where, you know, I got to a point where I realised I was being too passive, but it was to do with the fact that I knew there was probably a destroyer around here, and also I did not want to be making turns in front of enemy battleships and giving them broadsides, because the armour on this is alright, but it is pretty much the KGV's armour. I don't think it's completely identical, but, you know, the Monarch is essentially an up-gunned KGV, so you've got to be a little bit careful at this tier, but overall it's still a reasonably tough ship. So once I had the opportunity to turn, and once I'd actually made that realisation, you know, I'm now pushing back in. We've got a destroyer that's ahead of me capping, so we can be fairly certain that the Gade isn't here, or the Gader, I know what I mean. There's somebody I play with, or did play with at this point, that always called it the Gade, and it's slightly ingrained maybe, I don't know. Anyway, so this is me pushing in, is where I was at, I think. And as you can see, this Edinburgh, I'm not entirely sure. I think they were just manoeuvring a bit, and then suddenly, hey, there's a Monarch shooting at me. And I did manage to get one Citadel, as one tends to do on British destroyers. But then my guns after this point have been missing the mark a little bit. It's mostly been overpens. And in fact, that one there was a 0 damage pen and an overpen. So that's not so good. Now, I do know they have torpedoes, but I've forgotten to launch my plane. It's a bit of a poor man's solution to spotting incoming torps, but sometimes the planes, spotter planes and fighter planes, you know, they will still give you a bit of extra warning, so it's worth doing. But I just kind of neglected to, and so I have taken one on the nose and had to use my damage control. Now, the Kutuzov was clearly thinking the same thing, and I'm expecting more incoming torps, but that was pretty terrible positioning and angling. They just pulled out slowly broadside, reversed in front of my guns, and this time my guns did not troll me, so I was able to just finish them off with one blow. So there's the Kutuzov's torps, and of course I'm still spotted for this Edinburgh in the smoke, so we're just going to have to fire at other things, and I hope he doesn't pepper me too much, but I'm still reasonably healthy, so I'm not too worried. We're still down on points as well, but have you noticed? Yeah, our team has now seriously started to push. And it's been a bit towards, you know, my end of the map, and some of the enemy team got bottled up in the middle in a rather awkward position, which doesn't usually work. You know, usually you've got teams pressing in from two sides. It doesn't really work. One of the flanks fails, but in this case it somehow did. And even though we lost so much of that early map control, and we're still behind on points despite them being now on 4, well, just about to be 3 ships, if I can kill this Edinburgh. There we go, who's managed to flood me again, the rat bag, but I will survive. Yeah, generally speaking, that's not great, but in this case, it is that rare instance of, although we did cede the map control, we have then gone on to significantly outperform the enemy team in terms of dealing damage. And those two things don't usually both occur at the same time. Usually, as I've said, it's not a good indicator if you're giving away that much map control. But in this case, it was the rare exception. So it's just one destroyer left, and I've actually racked up a pretty decent amount of damage in this one somehow. Almost 130k. And there's a chance that I can maybe get a little bit more, but it's not going to be a Kraken or anything like that. But still, I think this is probably my best damage Monarch game to date. 130 is nothing super spectacular, but it's not half bad. It's all right, and especially considering the performance of these guns sometimes, the accuracy can be a bit waffish. Yeah, it would have been nice to kill the Edinburgh sooner, certainly, but in the end I had enough hit points to absorb the damage and just push forward, and it's all kind of worked out, especially as the team on the other side were also pushing. So final shots out, and there we go. Boop, did get the final kill, and that put me just a smidgen under 130k, which wasn't too bad. So 4 kills to go with that. It would have been nice to maybe kill some of those ships a little bit sooner and take a bit less damage, but for my efforts, 1900 base XP, and there was a fair few of the team that were, you know, like we had one person that was under 1000 XP, which is not too bad considering that most of the team, you know, it's like we all collectively realised beyond a certain point that, oh hey, they're getting lots and lots of victory points, and they have all the cap circles. Maybe we should do something about that. So it definitely wasn't just me having that little flash of, oh wait, I'm being too passive here. I think everybody did, or at least enough of the team did, to actually turn around and then make a difference. So this is partly why I picked out this one, because it was me being too passive, and it was the team as a whole being too passive, but then actually turning around and doing something about it collectively. So it's a bit of a rare sight in that regard, because normally if it starts off bad, it then tends to get worse from there. So hopefully you have enjoyed this replay, and if you have, you can leave any comments below, you can hit the like button, you can sub to my channel if you haven't already, and as always, stay tuned for more.